In this video, I'm going to explain how long plasterboard can last. Before we talk about the longevity of plasterboard, we first need to understand what plasterboard is. So all plasterboard is 2 layers of paper with a gypsum core. So it's basically ground up rocks between 2 pieces of paper. So I don't know if you know anything about paper, but it's very susceptible to moisture. And the gypsum core inside this isn't any better. So basically, if you want maximum longevity for plasterboard, you really want to keep it away from any moisture or damp. If I kept this plasterboard in a warm, temperature controlled environment with airflow around it, not exposed to any damp, it might last hundreds of years. But as soon as this gets subjected to damp, then the whole system falls apart and the plasterboard can deteriorate very quickly. So this is important when it comes to building your home and using plasterboard. There's a couple of ways to help plasterboard last a bit longer. I'm going to go through each one now. So whenever we're making a plasterboard wall, we've got our timber, we're making our plasterboard wall. We never have our plasterboard sat right down to the ground. The problem with that is any moisture coming up through the floor, any rising damp can get into the bottom of that plasterboard and cause it to blow. You'll find that your plasterboard, when they're exposed to damp or moisture, can go mouldy, you can get mildew there. The water will soak up and the plasterboard will start to crumble, and slowly the moisture will soak all the way up the plasterboard until it's destroyed the whole thing, or until it's reached a point where the damp dries out. So we always raise our plasterboard up off the ground to prevent any moisture coming into contact with the plasterboard directly. Now, probably the second most important thing you can do to extend the lifespan of your plasterboard is to make sure there's adequate airflow. So if this is a wall and it's going in front of an external wall, ideally we want airflow behind the plasterboard so everything can dry out. It's when we trap moisture that we end up getting problems. So if this is a stud wall and we've an external block wall, we'd always like to have a hole drilled in the floor to allow ventilation to go behind the timber stud wall. So we want to think about not having the plasterboard in contact with moisture. We want to think about airflow. We also want to think about temperature. One of the reasons that plasterboard deteriorates a lot quicker in a garage is due to large fluctuations in temperature and moisture content. Really, if you are using plasterboard in a garage, you want to treat it like a regular room. So you want to have a heater in there that maintains a constant internal temperature. Yes, it might cost you a bit more to heat your room and keep it at a steady temperature, but it's also going to preserve your plasterboard. So as long as the temperature remains steady and there's airflow around the plasterboard, it can last hundreds of years. But as soon as plasterboard gets damp, it crumbles quickly. Another thing that affects the longevity of plasterboard is impact resistance. Now, standard plasterboard as it stands with a paper finish is relatively prone to impact. Obviously in America they like to tape and joint the plasterboard joins between 2 boards and then they paint the paper. So really all you've got in your house is a layer of paper that's painted as your wall covering. So if you go into that with your elbow, chances are you're going to damage the plasterboard. Now I don't really consider this a major problem because it's easy to fill and sand down the filler and then repaint that plasterboard so it looks like no damage has ever been done. In the UK, rather than just filling the joins on the plasterboard, they like to skim the whole lot. So they put a 2mm layer of gypsum plaster, finishing plaster, all the way over the plasterboard to create one barrier to impact. This is good because it's a really smooth finish to paint and it also provides a bit of impact resistance. But the same rules apply. If that plasterboard with the skim on gets exposed to moisture, it's still going to deteriorate far quicker. Fire rated plasterboards are more resistant to heat. So if you've got a log burner or a chimney and you're looking at lining it with something, I definitely recommend looking at Fireboard. This actually provides an hour-long fire protection. So if your house does catch fire and you've used Fireboard, it will take a lot longer to burn through. Standard plasterboard gives you half an hour fire protection. You can actually double up standard plasterboard to give you an hour protection, which is exactly the same as your Fireboard. So if you've got a log burner, I tend to use fire plasterboard around that. Your only other option that I think is in existence is to use cement board or a hardy backer board. That's incredibly resistant to heat and you can also use that around your log burner. So fireboard or cement board would work fine there. And a lot of the boards that are specifically designed for moisture resistance, sound resistance and fire resistance are a little bit denser. Can't tell you exactly how long plasterboard will last. In a dry environment, it'll last 100 years. In a wet environment, it'll last 3 weeks. So the best thing you can do is keep your plasterboard warm and dry and away from moisture. I hope you've learned something from this video. If you have, drop us a like. If you have some comments that could help other people out determining the longevity of plasterboard, let us know below. If you want to stay updated with more helpful DIY videos that could assist you on your next project, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.